Hello? Today we're going to be reading The Crying of Lot 49 by Thomas Pynchon. Let's begin. Chapter 1. One summer afternoon, Mrs. Oedipa Moss came home from a Tupperware party whose hostess had put perhaps too much kirsch in the fondue to find that she, Oedipa, had been named executor, or she supposed executrix, of the estate of one Pierce and Verity, a California real estate mogul who had once lost $2 million in his spare time, but still had assets numerous and tangled enough to make the job of sorting it all out more than honorary. Oedipus stood in the living room, staring at the greenish dead eye of the TV tube, spoke the name of God, tried to feel as drunk as possible. But this did not work. She thought of a hotel room in Mazatlan whose door had just been slammed, it seemed forever, waking up 200 birds down in the lobby. A sunrise over the library slope at Cornell University that nobody out had seen because the slope faces west, a dry, disconsolate tune from the fourth movement of the Baroque Concerto for Orchestra, a whitewashed bust of Jay Gould that Pierce kept over the bed on a shelf so narrow for it she'd always had the hovering fear it would someday topple on them. Was that how he died, she wondered, among dreams, crushed by the only icon in the house? That only made her laugh out loud and hopeless. "Oh, you're so sick, Oedipa," she told herself. Or the room, which knew. The letter was from the law firm of Warp, Wistful, Kobotchek, and McMingus of Los Angeles, and signed by somebody named Metzger. It said Pierce had died back in the spring, and they'd only just now found the will. Metzger was to act as co-executor and special counsel in the event of any involved litigation. Oedipa had been named also to execute the will in a codicil dated a year ago. She tried to think back to whether anything unusual had happened around then. Through the rest of the afternoon, through her trip to the market in downtown Kinneret, among the pines to buy ricotta and listen to the muzak, today she came through the bead-curtained entrance around Bar 4 of the Fort Wayne Sacramento Ensemble's Variorum recording of the Vivaldi Kazoo Concerto. Boyd Beaver, soloist. Then through the sunned gathering of her marjoram and sweet basil from the herb garden, reading of book reviews in the latest Scientific American, to the layering of a lasagna, garlicking of a bread, tearing up the romaine leaves, eventually open on to the mixing of the Twilight's whiskey sours against the arrival of her husband, Wendell Mucho Moss, from work. She wondered, shuffling back through fat deckful of days which seemed, wouldn't she be first to admit it, more or less identical, or all pointing to the same way subtly like a conjurer's deck. Any odd one readily clear to a trained eye. It took her till the middle of Huntley and Brinkley to remember that last year at 3 or so one morning there had come this long-distance call from where she had never known, unless now he'd left a diary, by a voice beginning in heavy Slavic tones as second secretary at the Transylvanian consulate, looking for an escaped bat, modulated to comic Negro, then on into hostile Pachuto dialect, full of chingas and Maricones, then a Gestapo officer asking her in shrieks did she have relatives in Germany, and finally his Lamont Cranston voice, the one he'd talked to all the way down in Mazatlan. "Pierce, please." She'd managed to get her in. I thought we'd had... But Margot, earnestly. "I've just come from the Commissioner Weston that said the old man in the fun house was murdered by some blowgun that killed Professor Quackenbush, or something." "For God's sake," she said. Mucho had rolled over and was looking at her. "Why don't you hang up on him?" Mucho suggested, sensibly. "I heard that," Pierce said. "I think it's time Wendell Moss had a little visit from the shadow." Silence, positive and thorough, fell. So it was the last of his voices she'd ever heard. Lamont Cranston. That phone line could have pointed any direction, been any length. Its quiet ambiguity shifted over, in the months after the call, to what had been revived. Memories of his face, body, things he'd given her, things she had now and then pretended not to have heard him say. It took him over, and to the verge of being forgotten. The shadow waited a year before visiting, but now there was Metzger's letter. Had Pierce called last year to tell her about this codicil? Or had he decided on it later, somehow because of her annoyance and Mucho's indifference? She felt exposed, finessed, put down. She'd never executed a will in her life, didn't know where to begin, didn't know how to tell the law firm in L.A. that she didn't know where to begin. "Mucho, baby," she cried, in an access of helplessness. Mucho Mas, home, bounded through the screen door. "Today was another defeat," he began. "Let me tell you," she also began, but let Mucho go first. He was a disc jockey who worked further along the peninsula and suffered regular crises of conscience about his profession. "I don't believe in any of it, Ed," he would usually get out. "I truly can't." Way down there, further down perhaps than she could reach, so that such times often brought her near panic. It might have been the sight of her so about to lose control that seemed to bring him back up. "You're too sensitive." Yeah, there was so much else she thought of saying also, but this was what came out. It was true anyway. For a couple years he'd been a used car salesman, and so hyper-aware of what that profession had come to mean that working hours were exquisite torture to him. Mucho shaved his upper lip every morning 3 times, three times against the grain, to remove any remotest breath of a mustache. New blades drew blood invariably, but kept at it. Bought all natural shoulder suits, and went to a tailor to have the lapels made yet more abnormally narrow. On his hair, only used water, combing it like Jack Lemmon to throw them further off. The sight of sawdust, even pencil shavings, made him wince, his own kind being known to use it as hushing sick transmissions. And though he dieted, he could not, as Oedipa did use honey to sweeten his coffee, for, like all things viscous, it distressed him, recalling too poignantly what is often mixed with motor oil to ooze dishonest into gaps between piston and cylinder wall. He walked out of a party one night because somebody used the word cream puff. It seemed maliciously in his hearing. The man was a refugee Hungarian pastry cook talking shop, but there was your Mucho, thin-skinned. Yet, at least he had believed in the cars. Maybe no excess, now he could not, seeing people poorer than him come in, Negro, Mexican, cracker, a parade 7 days a week, bringing the most god-awful of trade-ins, motorized metal extensions of themselves, of their families, and what their whole lives must be like. Out there, so naked for anybody, a stranger like himself to look at. Frame cockeyed, rusty underneath, fender repainted in just a shade off to depress enough to depress the value, if not Mucho himself, inside smelling hopelessly of children, supermarket booze, 2, sometimes 3 generations of cigarette smokers, or only of dust. And when the cars were swept out, you had to look at the actual residue of these lives, and there was no way of telling what things had been truly refused, when so little he supposed came by that, out of fear, most of it had to be taken and kept. And what had simply, perhaps tragically, been lost, clipped coupons promising savings of 5 or 10 cents, trading stamps, pink flyers advertising specials at the markets, butts, tooth-shy combs, help-wanted ads, yellow pages torn from the phone book, rags of old underwear or dresses that were already period costumes, or wiping your own breath off the inside of a windshield so that you could see whatever it was, a movie, a woman or car you coveted, a cop who might pull you over just for a drill, for all the bits and pieces coated uniformly like a salad of despair, in a gray dressing of ash, condensed exhaust, dust, body wastes. It made him sick to look, but he had to look. If it had been an outright junkyard, probably he could have stuck things out, made a career, the violence that had caused each week being infrequent enough, far enough away from him to be miraculous, as each death, up until the moment of our own, is miraculous. But the endless rituals of trade-in, week after week, never got as far as violence or blood, and so were too plausible for the impressionable Mucho to take for long. Even if enough exposure to the unvarying gray sickness had somehow managed to immunize him, he still could never accept the way each owner, each shadow, filed in only to exchange a dented, malfunctioning version of himself for another, just as futureless automotive projection of somebody else's life. As if it were the most natural thing. To Mucho it was horrible, endless, convoluted incest. Oedipa couldn't understand how he could just get so upset, even now. By the time he married her, he had already been 2 years at the station, KCUF, and a lot of the pallid, roaring arterial was far behind him. like the Second World or Korean Wars were for older husbands. Maybe, God help her, he could have been in the war. Japs in trees, Krauts in tiger tanks, gooks with trumpets in the night that he might have forgotten sooner than whatever it was about the lot that strayed so alarmingly with him for going on 5 years. 5 years. You comfort them when they wake, pouring sweat or crying out of the language of bad dreams. Yes, you hold on them. They calm down. One day they lose it. She knew that. But when was Mucho going to forget? She suspected the disc jockey spot, which he'd got through his good old buddy at the KCUF advertising manager who visited the lot once a week, the lot being a sponsor, was a way of letting the top 200 and even the news copy that same jammering out of the machine. All the fraudulent dream of teenage appetites be a buffer between him and that lot. He'd believed too much in the lot. He believed not at all in the station. Yet to look at him now in the twilight living room, gliding like a large bird in an updraft toward the sweating shaker full of booze, smiling out of a fat vortex ring's center, you'd think it was all flat, calm, gold, serene, until he opened his mouth. Today, Funch, he told her, pouring, had me in, wanted to talk about my image, which he doesn't like. Funch being the program director and Mucho's great foe. I'm too horny now. What I should be is a young father, a big brother. These little chicks call in with requests, naked lust to Funch's ear, throbs in every word I say. So now I'm supposed to tape all the phone talk. Funch will personally edit out anything he considers offensive, meaning all of my end of the conversation. Censorship, I told him. Fink, I muttered, and fled. He and Funch went through some such routine maybe once a week. She showed him the letter from Metzger. Mucho knew all about her and Pierce. It had ended a year before Mucho married her. He read the letter and withdrew along a shy string of eye blinks. What am I going to do? She said. Oh, no, said Mucho. You got the wrong fella, not me. I can't even make our income tax right. Execute a will, there's nothing I can tell you. See Roseman, their lawyer. Mucho, Wendell, it was over. Before he put my name on it. Yeah, I meant only that. Ed, I'm not capable. So, next morning, that's what she did. Went and saw Roseman. After a half hour in front of her vanity mirror, drawing and having to redraw dark lines along her eyelids that each time went ragged or wavered violently before she could take the brush away, she'd been up the most of the night. After another 3 a.m. phone call, its announcing bell clear cardiac terror. So out of nothing did it come, the instrument 1 second inert, the next screaming. It brought both of them instantly awake, and they lay, joints locking, not even wanting to look at each other for the first few rings. She finally, having nothing she knew of to lose, had taken it. It was Dr. Hilarious, her shrink and psychotherapist, but he sounded like Pierce doing a Gestapo officer. I didn't wake you up, did I? He began, dry. You sound so frightened. How are the pills? Not working? I'm not taking them, she said. You feel threatened by them? I don't know what's inside them. You don't believe that they're only tranquilizers. Do I trust you? She didn't, and that's what she next explained why not. We still need 104th for the bridge, chuckled aridly. The bridge, Die Brücke, bringing his pet name for the experiment. He was helping the community hospital run on effects of LSD-25, mescaline, psilocybin, and related drugs on a large sample of suburban housewives. The bridge inward. When can you let us fit that into your schedule? No, she said. If you have 500,000 others to choose from, it's 3 a.m. We want you. Hanging on the air over her bed, she now beheld a well-known portrait of Uncle that appears in front of all of our post offices. His eyes gleaming unhealthily, his sunken yellow cheeks most violently rouged, his finger pointing between her eyes. I want you. She had never asked Dr. Hilarious why, being afraid of all he might answer. I'm having a hallucination now. I don't need drugs for that. Don't describe it, he said quickly. Well, was there anything else you wanted to talk about? Did I call you? I thought so, he said. I had this feeling, not telepathy, but rapport with the patient. That is a curious thing sometimes. Not this time. She hung up, and then couldn't get to sleep. But it would be damned if she'd take the capsules he'd given her. Literally damned. She didn't want to get hooked in any way. She told him that. So he shrugged. On me you were not hooked. Leave then, you're cured. She didn't leave. Not that the shrink held any dark power over her, but it was easier to stay. Who knew the day she was cured? Not him. He'd admitted that himself. Pills are different, she pleaded. Hilarious made a face at her, one he'd made before. He was all these delightful lapses from orthodoxy, his theory being that a face is symmetrical like a Rorschach blot, tells a story of a TAT picture, excites a response like a suggested word, so why not? He claimed to have once cured a case of hysterical blindness with his number 37, the Fu Manchu, many of the faces having, like German symphonies, both a number and nickname, which involved slanting the eyes up with the index fingers, enlarging the nostrils with the middle fingers, pulling the mouth wide with the pinkies, and protruding the tongue. On Hilarious, it was truly alarming, and in fact, as Oedipa's Uncle Sam hallucination faded, it was this Fu Manchu face that came dissolving in to replace it and stay with her for what was left in the hours before dawn. It put her in hardly any shape to see Roseman. But Roseman had also spent a sleepless night, brooding over the Perry Mason television program the evening before, which his wife was fond of, but toward which Roseman cherished a fierce ambivalence, wanting at once to be a successful trial lawyer like Perry Mason and, since this was impossible, to destroy Perry Mason by undermining him. Oedipa walked in, more or less by surprise, to catch her trusted family lawyer stuffing with guilty haste a wad of different sized and colored papers into a desk drawer. She knew it was the rough draft of the Profession v. Perry Mason, a not-so-hypothetical indictment, and had been in progress for as long as the TV show had been on the air. "You didn't used to look so guilty, as I remember," Oedipa said. They often went to the same group therapy sessions, in a carpool with a photographer from Palo Alto who thought he was a volleyball. That's a good sign, isn't it? "You might have been one of the Perry Mason spies," said Roseman. After thinking a moment, he added, "Ha ha, ha ha," said Oedipa. They looked at each other. "I have to execute a will," she said. "Oh, go ahead then," said Roseman. "Don't let me keep you." "No," said Oedipa, and told him all. "Why would he do a thing like that?" Roseman puddled, after reading the letter. "You mean die?" "No," said Roseman. "Name you to help execute it." He was unpredictable. They went to lunch. Roseman tried to play footsie with her under the table. She was wearing boots and couldn't feel much of anything, so insulated she decided not to make any fuss. "Run away with me," said Roseman when the coffee came. "Where?" she asked. That shut him up. Back in the office, he outlined what she was in for. Learn intimately the books in the business, go through probate, collect all debts, inventory the assets, get an appraisal of the estate, decide what to liquidate and what to hold on to, pay off claims, square away taxes, distribute legacies. "Hey," said Oedipa, "can't I get someone to do it for me?" "Me," said Roseman. "Some of it, sure, but aren't you even interested?" "In what?" "In what you might find out." As things developed, she was to have all manner of revelations, hardly about Pierce in veriarity or herself, but about what remained had yet somehow before this stayed away. There had hung this sense of buffering insulation. She had noticed the absence of an intensity, as if watching a movie, just perceptibly out of focus that the projectionist refused to fix, and had also gently conned herself into the curious Rapunzel-like role of a pensive girl, somehow magically prisoner among the pines and salt fogs of Kinneret, looking for somebody to say, "Hey, let down your hair." When it turned out to be Pierce, she happily pulled out the pins and curlers, and down it tumbled in its whispering, dainty avalanche. Only when Pierce had got maybe halfway up, her lovely hair turned, through some sinister sorcery, into a great unanchored wig, and down he fell on his ass. But, dauntless, perhaps using one of his many credit cards for a shim, he slipped the lock on the tower door and came up the conch-like stairs, which had true guile come more naturally to him. He'd have done much to begin with, but all that had gone on between them had never really escaped the confinement of that tower. In Mexico City, they somehow wandered into an exhibition of paintings by the beautiful Spanish exile Remedios Varo, on the central painting of a triptych titled Bordando el Manto Terrestre. There were a number of frail girls with heart-shaped faces, huge eyes, spun gold hair, prisoners in the top room of a circular tower, embroidering a type of tapestry which spilled out of the slit windows and into the void, seeking helplessly to fill the void. For all the other buildings and creatures, All the waves, ships, and forests of the earth were contained in this tapestry, and the tapestry was the world. Oedipa, perverse, had stood in front of the painting and cried. No one had noticed she wore dark green bubble shades. For a moment, she'd wondered if the seal around the sockets were tight enough to allow the tears simply to go on and fill up the entire lens space and never dry. She could carry the sadness of the moment with her that way forever. See the world refracted through those tears, those specific tears, as if indices had yet unfound, varied in important ways from cry to cry. She had looked down at her feet and known then, because of a painting, that what she stood on had only been woven together a couple thousand miles away in her own tower, was only by accident known as Mexico, and so Pierce had taken her away from nothing. There'd been no escape. What did she desire to escape from? Such a captive maiden, having plenty of time to think, soon realizes that her tower, its height and architecture, are like her ego, only incidental. That what really keeps her where she is magic, anonymous and malignant, visited on her from outside and for no reason at all. Having no apparatus except gut fear and female cunning to examine this formless magic, to understand how it works, how to measure its field strength, count its lines of force, she may fall back on superstition, or take up a useful hobby like embroidery, or go mad, or marry a disc jockey. If the tower is everywhere, and the night of deliverance no proof against its magic, what else? End of chapter 1.